It is no secret that Paul Thomas Anderson loves using the mobile frame, like tracking shots and steadicam shots, and he also loves using the long take. In fact, he often pairs the two together to heighten the tension of his scenes and at times create a phantasmagorical state where reality and fantasy become distorted as they meet at a crossroads. But what does Anderson's use of the mobile frame and long take reveal to us about his authorship and his stylistic signature? My aim today is to scratch the surface of this question by looking specifically at his 1970s disco craze porn industry film, Boogie Nights. Anderson's increasing fascination with the mobile frame and long take since Boogie Nights have to do with not only a desire to put his audience at the center of a largely subjective and objective position that his characters occupy, but also with the ability these devices have in stretching out time and space, and to quote Caldwell in his film analysis handbook, to create tension or serving as an elaborate establishing technique. What do these two connotations of establishment and tension, as associated with the mobile frame and long take, look like in Boogie Nights? Well, the following scenes will seek to shed some light on their function in the film. Right from the opening sequence, Anderson employs a tracking shot that initially manifests from a crane shot before landing on the ground and carrying over to a steadicam shot. This opening sequence is all about establishing, both in terms of setting, Reseda in the 70s, and of characters, and David Bordwell reaffirms this by stating, "A tracking shot can establish a locale and then smoothly let the characters enter the space." This opening tracking shot is also a long take in that, as Caldwell once again states, continues for a longer than usual time without edits or breaks in filming, a prominent feature or device in Anderson's films. As we enter the Hot Tracks establishment alongside the briefly established Maurice, Jack Horner and Amber Waves, the camera once again speaks larger volumes than the characters themselves, at least in this instance. It acts as an invisible observer in motion, and alongside the long take, Anderson uses the camera to steer us from one information-packed frame to another. Whether dependent on figure movement or independent of it, the mobile frame can profoundly affect how we perceive the space of the action. Imagine this sequence operating through simple straight cuts or even cross-cutting. It would provide a much more different experience for the audience than a mobile movement, and you wouldn't feel the same level of presence. Also notice how Maurice serves as the epicenter for our navigating of this space. We meet some of the key players in the film's narrative here, like Reith Rothschild, Buck Swope, eventually Roller Girl, and also eventually the protagonist, Eddie Adams or Dirk Diggler. And we occupy, as Bordwell states, a fairly dense visual field, where the spectator has more opportunity to scan the shot for particular points of interest. The framing can also move independently of the figures too. Sometimes the camera drifts away from the characters to reveal something of narrative importance like we see now. The mobile frame is motivated not by figure movement but by the demands of the narration. What is of narrative importance here though is the characters themselves, both to establish them and to provide some exposition, so it is drifting away for that purpose. In retrospect, the Boogie Nights opening sequence is centered on establishing through these camera movements, but more than that, it allows Anderson to craft an alluring and inviting setting into one of his most extroverted films. This sequence is also, while taking into account Hard 8, the crucial moment to one of the key identifiable stylistic traits in an Anderson film, the use of the long take in conjunction with the tracking shot. If we take a later long sequence that tracks Little Bill at a New Year's party, the effect of this mobile tracking movement serves a much more sinister purpose. Anderson, while still establishing the setting of the New Year's party house, like he did with the setting in the film's opening sequence, utilizes the mobile camera alongside the long take to present a quote-unquote complex pattern of events moving toward a goal. Initially, the upbeat mood of the party and the various small interactions between Little Bill and other attendees, as seen now with Buck, serves to normalize what is to be a tragic outcome. We also, in contrast to the opening sequence, have a much more jerky, sort of borderline handheld camera movement here, which adds further heat to the tension that is brewing.
Hey Kurt, have you seen my wife?
No.
Hey, they're doing that countdown thing. Come on in, man.
Okay.
What is perhaps most revelatory about Anderson's use of the tracking shot and long take, as applicable for instance in this whole sequence, is how, as George Tolles observes in his PTA book, Anderson pursues various methods of framing and tracking and cutting that cloud the issue of perspective or vantage points, often creating spaces and bits of temporality that seem shadow sites. They're neither subjectively nor objectively authorized, and they're not quite there when we try to pin them down. Now, what this means for Anderson's use of the camera and its relevance to his authorship is that he is concerned with a middle ground in his films when employing these tracking shots and long takes. That middle ground is neither subjective nor objective, and it reveals not only a tension between subjectivity and objectivity in his films, but also a tension between Anderson and his own work, a middle ground. Andrew Sarris has called this tension interior meaning, and deems it a necessary characteristic for an auteur of the cinema to have. What Anderson has done as a modern auteur, in contrast to the initial conception of interior meaning, is go beyond the mere tension between himself and his film, and instead find tension in perspective through tracking shots and long take. This tension has become visible across his body of work, and I call this tension a nudge toward expression, or the need for Anderson to intervene in these tense scenes and remove perspective. I would go so far as to call this removal of perspective in Anderson's films as a ploy for surprise. In an interview for Der Spiegel in 2003, Anderson stated that there is an old rule that says you can annoy your audience for 2 minutes, but don't let them know 10 seconds in advance what's going to happen. I try to surprise the audience, they resist that. We see that rule in effect here as Anderson, towards the end of the long take, lets his audience believe that Little Bill's homicide of his porn star wife and her partner will be the end. But just as the audience is led to believe that, 10 seconds later, Anderson dares to surprise. As Adrian Danks states in his book, A Companion to Robert Altman, Anderson, like Altman, his friend and influence who passed away in 2006, isn't set on giving a closed and polished statement, but instead he adheres to the roughness of the filmmaking process that seeks to give the broad shape of an idea. Now, what this means in the context of the Little Bill suicide sequence is that Anderson doesn't necessarily use this long take to provide closure, but to ask broader questions about his characters and concerns, such as, what does it mean to be ethical in the porn industry? How does human interaction function in this historical context? The use of the long take by Anderson and many indie auteurs like Kelly Reichardt, Sofia Coppola and Wes Anderson helps, as Sconce claims, to produce tension through dividing audience and story world, fostering a sense of clinical observation. For Anderson, it has become a device that he relies on, as seen with the Little Bill sequence, to raise those broader aforementioned questions, and thus it reflects an aspect of his authorial expressivity.